All right. Good morning, everyone. Give folks
Good morning. So sorry about the delay. I had problems with technical difficulties. It wouldn't let me log in as host.
Oh, no worries. I was a little bit worried. I was thinking, oh, goodness, am I the host? But anyway, here we are. And it looks like folks are still coming in. So that's great. Okay. Give everyone another little moment to get started. Let's see. It is 9:02. I think I'll go ahead and get started. I'm Emile Hinnov, and I am happy to be chairing this panel on Mrs. Dalloway Scales of Illness and Care. Welcome, everyone. Right. Okay, so we have three wonderful presentations to look forward to today. They'll present in the order of the program, and I'll also let them read their own titles. Laci Mattison is our chat moderator. Thank you, Laci. And please feel free to post your questions and comments in the chat at any time during the presentations. I'd also like to take maybe about 5 minutes after the presenters are finished, just to give everyone a moment to take a breath and gather their thoughts before the Q&A session. Okay, so our first presenter is Ananya Sasaru, who is a third-year PhD student in the Department of English at the University of Calcutta in India. Her research is based on post-Second World European cinema and architectural philosophy. She wrote her Master of Philosophy dissertation on the ethics and politics of female mental illness, focusing on Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Her areas of interest include film studies, gender studies, philosophy, and modernism. Our next presenters are Elie Matta and Emile Whaibeh. Elie is an English literature and language graduate from the Lebanese University in Lebanon. He is passionate about being an English teacher with experience working with students at the intermediate level. He's currently pursuing his master's degree in English literature and writing his thesis on heterotopias in Mrs. Dalloway. His interests include education, literature, technology, and social justice, and he is based in Beirut, Lebanon. Elie will be joined by Emile, who is a researcher and instructor in the Department of Public Health at the University of Balamand in Beirut, Lebanon. He's currently a PhD candidate at the Doctoral School of Science and Health at St. Joseph University. Emile holds a master's degree in public health and a bachelor's degree in English language and literature. His research interests include mental health, social determinants of health, and interdisciplinary research at the intersection of health sciences and literature. Emile is also based in Beirut, Lebanon. And then our last presenter today is Caylee Weintraub. She's an adjunct instructor at the Florida Gulf Coast University. Her research includes interests in animal studies, eco-criticism, health humanities, and material studies. She's presented work on pet keeping at the Southeastern Society of 18th Century Studies and the Sigma Tau Delta International Convention. She will present at the International Virginia Woolf Society panel at the MLA conference in 2023. So welcome everyone and welcome our presenters. If Ananya is ready to get started, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. Good morning to all of you, but also good evening, since I'm from India and right now here it's evening. So it's good to be a part of this amazing conference and to meet you all people. And unfortunately, I couldn't send my paper beforehand, but I do have a PPT and I'll just check if I can share it. If just one of you can let me know if it is visible. Right. All right, so the title of my paper is Medical Ethics and Hospitality in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. And I'm going to start by reading out two snippets from Virginia Woolf's letters. Here's the first one. Discussing the character of Septimus Smith in one of her letters to Gwen Ravera, Virginia Woolf writes, and I quote, "It was a subject that I had kept cooling in my mind until I felt I could touch it without bursting into flame all over. You can't think what a raging furnace it is still to me, madness and doctors and being forced." In another letter, which was composed long back in the summer of 1904, when her father, Leslie Stephen, passed away, she writes, "And yet that tyrannical, and as I think, short-sighted savage insists upon another too. Really, a doctor is worse than a husband. Oh, how thankful I shall be to be my own mistress and throw their silly medicines down the slop pail. I never shall believe or have believed in anything any doctor says. I learned their utter helplessness when father was ill. They can guess at what's the matter, but they can't put it right." Throughout her life, Woolf had been diagnosed with several ailments, ranging from influenza, pneumonia, something called a tired heart, to a more debilitating progression of her mental condition that led to her death by suicide. Dealing with a number of medical tragedies within the family, for example, the death of her parents, her half-sister Stella, and her brother Toby, Woolf always had lived under the perplexing and overpowering shadows of doctors. While some experiences have pushed her to a state of confinement that stifled her for days in the name of rest cure, others have led her question the medical monopoly that often labeled and categorized patients, reducing them to mere symptoms. The suffocation of thriving under this paralyzing medical gaze is summed up in the 2002 film, The Hours, where Virginia vents out to Leonard at the railway station. I quote, I'm attended by doctors who inform me of my own interests, echoing several other victims in the corpus of literature, for example, Sylvia Plath, Charlotte Parkins Gilman, Janet Frame, and so on. Drawing upon her personal experience and critiquing different types of power dynamics that insert an individual into the dual oppressive structures of patriarchy and psychiatry, Woolf draws the character of Clarissa and Septimus Smith in her 1925 novel, Mrs. Dalloway. Septimus's madness and the medicalization by the doctors, Dr. Holmes and Sir William Bradshaw, depicts how misguided paternalism not only confuses the patient, but also the family members, and how the discursive representations and practices systematically form the objects of which they speak, thus constructing realities in specific ways and naturalizing particular forms of social control. Dr. Holmes contributes to Septimus's mental illness by turning a blind eye to the seriousness of the matter and dismissing his case as someone who is a little out of sorts. William Bradshaw, on the other hand, despite being a specialist, misguides the couple by quickly prescribing rest cure at some faraway home without first diagnosing or even listening to what Septimus tries to convey. These two figures, carved out in the image of Woolf's daughter, that is Dr. George Savage, and Wire Michel, and several other Western practitioners from the time, produces madness as a malady that can be regulated, reproduced, maintained, and elaborated by the social structures. For those of us who are acquainted with Michel Foucault's famous work, Madness and Civilization, we know that he gives us a trajectory of madness starting from the medieval age when people had comparatively more freedom than the age of reason, which he calls the Great Confinement, where they were treated almost at par with the prisoners. And then comes the modern age when, despite the kind of barbaric and cruel acts were off the table, but the imperative to go and confess to the doctors and the practitioners kind of gave the power to them to construct certain truth and realities. So the scientific and intellectual regimes, which hailed scientists and doctors as almost godlike sages, sent for abolishing sickness and cure humans of all their problems in their concern with the body, were actually mixed with the power interests. At the first level, Septimus's madness and the medicalization by the doctors, Sir William Bradshaw and Dr. Holmes, has been depicted so as to show how madness, or rather a deviation from the heteronormative behavior, is prone to clinical misdiagnosis. An ex-army man and an individual sufferer, Septimus is tortured by the upsurge of the repressed memories of the war and what the doctors term as delayed shell shock, while the nature of illness that Clarissa suffers from is left unclear. Perceived by his wife Razia, the doctors and others, sometimes as behaving oddly, and in other times as nothing seriously wrong with him, Septimus is alienated from the social relations. And just as he could not read the language of the words built by the airplane on the sky, he couldn't grasp the language of rationality imposed upon him by the psychiatrist or the society. The theory and practice of locking up the mats in an enclosed space and subjecting them to calculating forms of observations and intense disciplinary rules and regulations emerged with the birth of psychiatry in the early 19th century. With the dual task of both managing the mats and of gaining and systematizing knowledge, the asylum cultivated an overactive and misguided mental health system, which by the 20th century witnessed a proliferation of treatments, diagnosis, and discourses. In the face of such monolithic, centralized, and repressive apparatus, used both by structures of institutionalization and pharmacratic tendencies, it is important to rethink newer ways of articulating experiences and of opening up paths, which brings me to the second part of my paper, where I'm going to discuss the various dimensions of hospitality in Mrs. Dalloway and look at hospitality as a feminist performative extension of care ethics. Hospitality typically concerns various figures of otherness, the stranger, the exile, the foreigner, the nomad, and so on. A given power is legitimized in exercising sovereignty by establishing the division between a friend and an enemy, between those who belong to nation states and those who fall outside the domain. The responsibility towards the other gives rise to the idea of hospitality, which, explored both by Levinas and Derrida, primarily means the unquestioning offering to the other without any expectation of reciprocity. Hospitality thus reflects a universal world order in which the self is asked to overcome its local attachment and welcome the other into the private sphere of the home and the public sphere of society. In Of Hospitality, Derrida refers to the figure of the foreigner as the bad man. I quote, "I'm therefore fearful that what I have said may give you the opportunity of looking on me as someone deranged, who is upside down all over," unquote. Who imposes a threat to the host or turns out to be the paternal and the reasonable authority of the logos. Just as madness threatens the sanctity of the so-called normal world when it tries to step into the threshold of the sane people and is in turn threatened by them, the foreigner also fears that he or she would be mistaken as the deranged. Hospitality thus becomes an ethical stance of opening up to the other that helps one to fight the madness and the fear of it. First, when one is in a state of anguish and fear of going mad, and second, when one is empathetic to the suffering, incomprehensibility, or muteness of the mad others. A feminist theory of hospitality informs policies and practices that have far too long been devalued the work of caring and has the potential to refrain emotional labor to a position of social value as a resistance against patriarchal injustice. The ethics of care is historically a female contribution, and the female welcoming of the other has been coextensive of women's historical task of providing care for others. The need for a feminist hospitality to subvert historically the masculine manifestations of hospitality can be traced in Mrs. Dalloway through the following 3 points. So I'm just going to discuss these 3 points. The first, the party that Mrs. Dalloway throws, I'm looking at it as a hospitable agency for Mrs. Dalloway. The second, memories of the spectral recollection of the past. And third, shared world fidelity and the act of surprise. Starting with the first one, traditionally speaking, women perform all the labors of hospitality, and yet the host is invariably a man. In Mrs. Dalloway, party or the act of welcoming others become a form of creative agency that stands on the shoulders of Clarissa alone, as much as the painting is for Lily Briscoe into the lighthouse, or the play is for Miss Latrobe in between the acts. In welcoming the known and the unknown in her party, Mrs. Dalloway finds her identity no longer as Richard Dalloway's wife, but as a creative artist who seeks to knit together and strengthen social bonds through psychic and material sharing. The second point, Mrs. Dalloway's recollections begin early in the novel. When admiring the freshness of the morning, she recalls the pristine days of her early girlhood, which were full of life and vitality. What a lark, what a plunge, for so it had always seemed to her. Burst open the French windows and plunged at both turn into the open air. Soon the fresh memory of the past starts growing darker as the unsettled and disturbing ghosts from the past begins to haunt her. Septimus's hallucination of events is paralleled by Clarissa's recollection of the odd affinities with strangers and ongoing connections with her distant friends. Peter and Sally, who had been lost to the past a long time ago, return, first in her memory and then in her party like ghosts. The return of the ghosts do not merely suggest the return of the repressed, but also the ghosts lead towards an ethical positioning of the humans by binding them in a state of responsibility to seek justice from the past wrongdoings. In the case of Septimus Smith, this is made evident by the fact that he has lost his friend in the same war which he has survived. And thus, the specter of events haunts him on behalf of all the war victims as a kind of justice-seeking phenomena. The past and the hearing of dead voices from the past are integral to madness. Woolf herself has mentioned in her letters and diaries of the voices that torment her time and again, and it is only after she writes to the lighthouse that the voices of her dead parents were put to rest. In Mrs. Dalloway, she fictionalized the psychotic voice hearing that she herself associated with the early experiences of her childhood sexual abuse, patriarchal bullying, and early loss of parental care. Allowing the ghost from the past to resurface, she gives rise to a kind of hospitality that allows her to welcome the repressed figures and feelings. This feeling of being at home with oneself refers necessarily to memory, recollection as a relation to the language of the host, as a recollection of the first hospitality prior to any other. And finally, the last point, Shared World is basically the name of a book by Irigaray. In Sharing the World, Lucy Irigaray insists upon a faithful relationship with one's dwelling while also allowing oneself to be changed by an encounter. This fidelity to oneself becomes a precondition for welcoming the other and challenges the traditional form of hospitality that refuses to be transformed by the guests. In other words, a true welcome implies the possibility of constructing a new and a third world as a result of my world's meeting with that of the other, something that Clarissa experiences at the time of the party when the news of Septimus Smith almost comes like a surprise. So the act of surprise is also an integral phenomena in this entire idea of hospitality, where the other comes without your invitation, almost like a surprise visit, and it kind of changes your world. It turns your world upside down. Clarissa almost plays out the entire event of death in her mind. She was unnerved at Septimus's accomplishment of an act that had always instilled in the depth of her heart an awful fear. While at the same time, she is assured of her own mortal existence, the affirmation of life and creativity, and somehow manages to go back to her party, her life. Clarissa has performed the role of a host twice before in the novel. She welcomes Peter Walsh to her home almost surprisingly, who began all his recollections of the past after meeting her, that almost becomes a prelude to the grand party where she plays the actual perfect hostess. And finally, a host that unconditionally welcomes the death news of Septimus at the threshold of her party, although it threatens a violence upon her through which she herself leaps into death with him. Such welcoming of the dead other also enables her to confront reality of her fears and her attempt to hold on to life, despite feeling quite similar, like Septimus, about the ways of life. Having never met one another, both still becomes a part of each other while remaining individualistic in their final take on life and death. In the final part of the novel, she is made to confront the death news of Septimus Smith. Quote, "In the middle of my party, here is death," she thought. And it is only through the death of Septimus that she was able to encounter the otherness of him and discover her anew. Levinas's notion of death rests on the idea that death is always the death of the other. And it is through this death of the other person that we are able to experience the ability of the other person to change us, alter our world, and finally help us becoming other to ourselves. According to Levinas, otherness only can be revealed through the other person, and this revelation is experienced when the other person does something that alters my world. In the novel, the death of Septimus brings a new realization in Mrs. Dalloway, as this suicide seemed to her to be another way of communicating and the ultimate form of man's defiance. This communication unites Clarissa and Septimus, and it seems this moment of silence is the only moment in the novel when Septimus is finally heard and understood, although after his death. Clarissa, who has throughout the novel found it problematic to extract the meaning of this thing called life, now has broken through the reality of something not herself, transcending beyond the Bond Street that has always succeeded in entrapping Mrs. Dalloway. Thank you.
Our next presenters can go ahead and start whenever you're ready. Thank you, Ananya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elie, and Emile and I are going to present today our research paper on caregiver burden and patient guilt in Mrs. Dalloway. This is just a quick outline of our presentation. Okay, so obviously caring for someone with a chronic illness is taxing both on the physical and the mental levels. And this is the case because it has several negative consequences, whether on the health of the patient or on the health of the caregiver. And these consequences include, for example, the gradual deterioration in the health of the caregiver and the patient. And since it takes away from their leisure time and it affects their ability to go to work, for example, and caregiver burden also affects, or disrupts the lives of the patients and their families because they have to get adapted to a new routine. They have to change their lives. They have to, if you want, make some sacrifices in order to make things do. Historically, the act of caregiving has been seen as a female task, and it eventually led to the birth of the profession of nursing. In her essay on being ill, Woolf talks about how little illness actually is mentioned in literature and how burdensome the process of caregiving can be for the caregiver. She gives the analogy of the human race to show how the ill may be impeding the progress of the healthy, and this is clearly seen in her novel, Mrs. Dalloway. In Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf presents a detailed depiction of illness, and her aim was to showcase the experiences of the ill in juxtaposition of those of the healthy. Moreover, the novel highlights the effects of illness on caregivers, with Lucrezia taking center stage in this area. So this paper argues that Lucrezia's gender and social status render her caregiving role a much more taxing feat compared to the other caregivers in the novel, who are Richard and Hugh. I'm just going to go quickly over some of the literature regarding caregiving and the process of caregiving. When it comes to caregiving, it was actually discussed either when it comes to its 4 different dimensions or when it comes to its 2 types. It can affect the individual on the physical, psychological, emotional, and socioeconomic levels. And Montgomery et al. Discussed 2 different types of burden. Objective burden, which is linked to the different tasks that the caregiver has to do for the recipient, such as, for example, spending some time with them, helping them move around the house, etc. Whereas subjective burden is related to the emotional distress that the caregiver faces as a result of caregiving. And needless to say, the more one suffers from objective burden, the worse their subjective burden is. Why was caregiving considered a female burden, and how did it affect the female caregivers? According to Holton, Hoffman, and Mitchell, etc., when we talk about caregiving in the first half of the 20th century, it was mostly seen as a female burden because women had more time to spend on caregiving since they were not allowed to take on jobs or occupations outside of the house. And they were expected to carry out these tasks that are related to personal care, daily management, especially when it comes to chores around the house. As a result, however, women experienced several interferences with their personal and social lives. Since they no longer had any time for themselves, they were expected to be around the care recipient at all times, so they could not go on with their lives as they used to. Virginia Woolf was aware of caregiving burden since she and her husband have experienced it firsthand. As such, before writing Mrs. Dalloway, Woolf writes in her diary that she wants to give life and death, sanity and insanity. Her aim was to criticize the social system and to show it at work at its most intense. And as such, Mrs. Dalloway can be seen as Woolf's way of juxtaposing life and death and highlighting how the social system at the time did not only fail the ill, but it may have also failed their caregivers. To build on the juxtaposition of life and death, many critics see Septimus as Clarissa's double. They see them as representatives of the duality of life and death, of loss and recovery. And by looking at the novel from this perspective, new readings of Septimus' suicide can be discussed. For example, Kelly believes that Septimus' suicide transforms Clarissa, and this is seen in the last scene where Clarissa contemplates death but refuses to die to suicide, all thanks to Septimus' experience. Shaoxi and Rasmussen, on the other hand, believe that Septimus' suicide is an act of communication, either to Clarissa or to the British society as a whole, but Rasmussen takes it even further, and he claims that Septimus' suicide can be seen as an act of communication to the medical profession of the time, and its aim was to criticize how the medical profession has failed the ill.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emile, so I'll be taking over this part. Basically, what we thought we would do with this novel is that we wanted to look at caregiver burden from a fresh perspective in regards to different characters. Instead of just looking at Septimus and Clarissa, we wanted to look at Lucrezia, Richard, and Hugh. And for the purpose of this analysis, we decided to appraise caregiver burden in the novel. To do so, we decided to go with an adapted version of the informal caregiving integrative model, which is a conceptual framework for caregiver burden that is proposed by Gerin and Zek. And the way the framework works is that caregiver burden has its own determinants, and then it also has its own mediators, also known as like factors which can modulate the burden in either direction. And then you have the outcomes or how this burden is going to manifest at the level of the caregiver. So what are the kind of constructs that we focused on when it comes to determinants? We looked at caregiver characteristics. So what is the gender of the caregiver, knowing that women are more prone to have caregiver burden or caregiver burnout compared to their male counterparts. We looked at employment status because employment status is also important in both ways. In some sense, a caregiver that is employed might have some time to be away from home, to be away from their duties so that they can have some distraction. But on the other hand, if you have to juggle your work duties as well as your caregiving tasks, that can add to your burden. And certainly none of us have just one role in life. Everyone has multiple roles. And needless to say, having more than one role means you have a lot more responsibility. That would make you more prone to having a caregiver burnout. Then we have to look also at the types of burden, as Elie mentioned earlier. We looked at the objective burden, but we also looked at the subjective burden. So we looked at the tasks that the caregivers had to deliver, but also we looked at how it made them feel, the emotional response that they had to those tasks that they had to do. And of course, as Elie mentioned, the more objective burden you have, you tend to have higher subjective burden as well. Finally, we also looked at the social environment because the family support and the social support that one gets also can be a protective factor from caregiver burnout. And with the absence of that can definitely contribute to making the person have a heavier burden to carry as a caregiver. We also looked at the modulating factors or the mediators. We looked at relationship quality. So what is the relationship between the caregiver and the care recipient? The more stable the relationship is, the easier caregiving gets. And also the severity of the illness can determine the deterioration, the rate at which a relationship can deteriorate as a result of illness. We also looked at coping strategies. How is the caregiver coping with the changed life that they're now living with? Having a more optimistic approach has shown to reduce caregiver burnout, but rather having a defeatist approach or not having a lot of hope, feeling hopeless, can actually make the person feel less hopeful that their partner is going to recover, and that can add to their burnout. Of course, the more you have coping strategies, the better you're able to adapt with caregiver burden, and that is already established in the literature. So how does this relate to the work of the novel, and how did we try to look at it from that perspective? Of course, as I said, what was interesting for us is to juxtapose the caregiver character of Lucrezia in juxtaposition to Richard and Hugh, and to look at all those different categories and how everything shakes up. So when it comes to the caregiver characteristics, already we know that Lucrezia is the only female between the three that we are comparing. We also know she is of a lower social status, of a lower economic status, and age has been debated in the literature if it has a connection with the caregiver burden or not. But in Lucrezia's case, her age being younger than the others meant that she was less established, she was less financially secure, and that also added to the strain that she was experiencing. So Lucrezia definitely at this level, just looking at the characteristics of the character, she's starting off at a disadvantage. Caregiver burden is going to be heavier on her just from baseline. But then we have to look at the caregiver or the burden type that each one of those characters has to carry. And Lucrezia has to do the most tasks. So the number of tasks that she has to do are far larger than what Richard and Hugh are supposed to do. She spends most of her time with her husband. She has to take care of him. We know that he has a more severe condition or more severe ailment than the other characters, and she feels very trapped because of this caregiving role, and she expresses it throughout the novel. Whereas with Richard, Clarissa doesn't seem to be causing him too many problems, and anyway, Clarissa has a more comfortable life. She's able to have people supporting her at her home. She doesn't have all the responsibilities on her, so she's more relaxed, and he's able to casually attend lunches and visit shops. He seems to be living a much more different life than what Lucrezia is living. We don't know much about Hugh. We know that he might be relying on more formal caregivers for Evelyn, so that doesn't seem to be also impeding him in any way. So again, we can see here that Lucrezia is again at the disadvantage at this level. Greater objective as well as subjective burden. Looking at the social environment, it becomes even more evident for us. We know that both Richard and Hugh are well respected, well connected. They are always attending events. They have a better social life. Lucrezia lacks that social support. She is a foreigner. She has no family in England. The only person who's kind to her is Mrs. Kilman and Mrs. Filmer, and through that relationship, she appreciates that the kindness that is given to her. She makes a hat for her daughter, and she's trying to build that social network for herself so that she doesn't feel as alone as she does, especially when we see her in the park. Looking at the relationship quality, again, we don't know a lot about Hugh. We do know that Richard has to fight off, the memories of Peter Walsh, but Richard is able to display his affection to Clarissa through, indirect gestures like flowers and gifts, and we see the same thing happening more or less with Hugh. With Lucrezia, her relationship seems to have been a much better place before everything happened, but it does seem that the relationship is deteriorating quickly. This is evidenced in the scene where Septimus notices the missing wedding ring, realizes that his relationship is, the marriage basically is in danger, and quote, their marriage was over, he thought, with agony, with relief. So this is not an indication that this is a good relationship at that point in the story. And then we get to the different coping strategies that each one of those characters had dealing with their caregiving roles. So for Lucrezia, she could not leave her husband alone. She had to stay by his side. And this was according to the doctor's instructions as well. And in many ways, she was unable to distract herself because even though she was employed, she had to do her work from home and she had to be with her husband the entire time. She could not detach herself from her environment. So the only escape for her was nostalgia. We see Clarissa doing the same thing, but for Lucrezia, nostalgia means reminiscing about a time where her relationship was in a better place also. So that doesn't make it better. It actually increases the burden and increases the burnout that she's feeling, and it increases her hopelessness. For Richard and Hugh, they experience less of that type of burden. They're able to dissociate themselves from their lives, from their wives, and many times, and we see them taking that physical distance, which is also conducive to an emotional distraction. And this is what Gérard and Zach talked about as well. Emotional distraction is a protective factor from caregiver burnout. So by being away at certain times, they're able to recover, and that would help the relationship, but that certainly also help them with dealing with that burnout. So I just discussed everything that could be contributing to caregiver burnout. I will leave the floor now to Elie to look at caregiver burnout as an outcome.
Okay, thank you. So if we look at all the factors that Emile has just mentioned, it becomes apparent that Rexia is the one who suffers from the most caregiver burden, especially when compared to Hugh and to Richard. She has a much more demanding job. She is physically and psychologically affected by caregiving, and she has or she receives no social support whatsoever. So because of Rexia's situation, we as readers tend to sympathize with her the most, much more than with Richard and with Hugh. However, Woolf does not want the readers to sympathize with Lucrezia. Emile, can we move on to the following slide, please? Thank you. So Woolf does not want the readers to experience this feeling of sympathy towards Lucrezia. She wants to find a solution to end her suffering. And Woolf talks about sympathy, and she criticizes sympathy on being ill. I won't read the quote because it's quite long, but based on this quote, we can immediately know that Woolf does not want us to have sympathy, because a world that is built on sympathizing with the other does not move forward. It stops, and eventually it ends with horror and despair. So as such, in order to end Lucrezia's suffering, Woolf decides to take away the main cause of that suffering, which we have already discussed. So when Septimus dies to suicide, he is no longer part of the human race, and thus he can no longer impede Lucrezia's progress. By killing Septimus, Woolf releases Lucrezia of her burden and allows her to continue living her life freely. Finally, so by looking at caregiver burden in the case of Lucrezia, Hugh, and Richard, we can reach an alternative reading of Septimus' suicide. Septimus dying to suicide is Woolf's way of releasing Lucrezia of her caregiver burden. The final recipient of Septimus' message, if we want to go back to the idea of Septimus' suicide being a communicative act, is neither Clarissa nor the medical profession, as other critics have, if you want, discussed before. We believe that the final recipient of that message is Lucrezia, and she understands her husband's sacrifice and accepts it with a smile on her face by the end of the novel. Septimus' death is Virginia Woolf's way of releasing Lucrezia of the burden of caregiving. It is also Septimus' way of turning the tables, of inviting Lucrezia this time to look at the door for a way out and for a new chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elie and Emile. That was fantastic. All right. So our last presenter is Caylee.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to my paper in the chat. So if you'd like to follow along with the access copy, it'll be there. I also have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull that up. 1 second. Okay. Is everyone able to see my PowerPoint okay? All right, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. All the papers have been just so amazing, so I'm so glad to be here. So today I will be presenting on the world of the infinitely small microbic networks in Mrs. Dalloway. In 1928, a London Times medical correspondent describes how it is not an exaggeration to say a new world of living things has been revealed, comparable to that world of microorganisms which Pasteur discovered and which he called the world of the infinitely small. The medical correspondent describes here how the influenza pandemic of 1918 through 1919 revealed a microscopic, virulent world. Informed by the 19th century's golden age of bacteriology and Robert Koch's groundbreaking 1876 discovery of bacteria as the cause of tuberculosis and cholera, the cause of influenza in the 20th century was, following Koch's germ theory, attributed to bacteria, also called the ultra-invisible and filter passers. Bacteria were believed to exist in the ground, in a prepared soil in which pneumonia and other diseases flourished during winter. Headlines in the London Times by the Medical Congress speak to the widespread attention bacteria had garnered: defense against bacteria, invisible microbes, the influenza bacillus, to name just a few. Numerous advertisements in the London Times by the Medical Congress, numerous advertisements in the London Times for Formalin and Yaddle, antiseptics which promise to destroy all microbic presence, indicate scientists and marketers' widespread attention to bacteria and its infectious, invisible nature. Virginia Woolf was intimately acquainted with bacteria. Several of her teeth were removed in the early 1920s following bouts of influenza because they were believed to harbor bacteria that caused mental health problems. Even conditions of the mind, such as shell shock, were attributed to lingering bacteria from influenza infections in soldiers. Given the historical context of bacteria and the way it was a spectral embodiment of influenza, I argue for a microbial reading of illness in Mrs. Dalloway. The bacterial network Woolf represents is a dynamic, shifting life force. Bacteria offer a way to read the Zoonarrative, a narrative with the non-human as its focalizer of the influenza pandemic. The story of influenza is the story of the proliferation of bacteria. Woolf scholars have examined Mrs. Dalloway through the theoretical frameworks of illness studies and animal studies, but I join these two areas of Woolf scholarship to illuminate the involvement of the non-human in reading illness networks. Scholars like Elizabeth Alka, Viral Modernism, have studied Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway for its representations of influenza, yet what has been left out of these discussions in Woolf's text are the non-human bacterial agents who embody these illness networks. Alka argues that if we read Virginia Woolf in the context of the influenza outbreak, the pandemic emerges everywhere. Looking everywhere requires looking even for the bodies that are so small we do not notice them until they demand our attention. It requires seeing illness in its embodied bacterial form. Following other microbe-focused readings, such as Louise Westling's examination of cesspools into the lighthouse, I apply the same microscopic lens to Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway to reveal how bacterial bodies emerge in the text. I argue that Woolf's representation of fermentation, swamps, mold, veils, mists, and conglomerations, common shapes of bacterial colonies, make visible the bodies of invisible bacteria. I examine Woolf's images of decay in deep time in the novel as a representation of a post-anthropocentric, bacteria-dominated world, a possibility which might not have seemed so distant considering the widespread deaths attributed to bacteria in the 20th century. Finally, I analyze representations of the decentered body in the text. I examine how Clarissa's transcendental theory echoes a bacterial body, one composed of many individual entities functioning as a collective being and who share consciousness, history, and networks. So for the first part, looking for bacteria through decomposition and fermentation. Bacteria become visible in the text, particularly through Woolf's representation of decomposition. Decomposition, the natural dissolution of compound bodies, is the visible work of invisible bacteria. Bacteria eat through the body and reduce it to its constituent elements. Decomposition may seem to occur without the aid of a living presence in the text, yet bacteria are the forces that biologically break the body down to its essence. Decomposition in 20th century life was closely associated with death on the battlefield. Accounts of no man's land where bodies slowly decomposed down to bones haunt soldiers' accounts of war. Many injured soldiers died of subsequent bacterial infections, particularly Staphylococcus. The process of death is a process of bacterial work, and the breaking down of the cell through bacteria is evident when Septimus envisions this process of decomposition while he sits in Regent's Park with Rezia. In this scene, Septimus imagines the breakdown of the body. He opens his description with a scientific gaze of death. Scientifically speaking, his body was macerated. This kind of scientific attitude toward the process of death frames death in biological terms. Rather than being a spiritual process, death here is organic and natural. The image of flesh that is melted off the world is reminiscent of the slow decomposition of flesh by bacteria, a process which might take days or weeks for the skin to appear to melt from the body. Elizabeth Alka reads Septimus's description of his body in this passage as a hallucination and fear of the fever dissolving the self. I read Septimus's hallucination more microscopically. He describes his maceration until only the nerve fibers were left. The word macerated underscores this image of decay, as it is associated with wastage or decay, but also the breakdown of the body into constituent elements. This word, which specifically points to breakdown into smaller pieces, is an action made possible through bacteria, which soften the body and consume it. Septimus describes becoming part of the soil and earth. Decomposition breaks his body down into organic matter. It is also worth noting that Septimus's name shares the same root as the word sepsis, meaning putrefaction, decomposition, and rot. Furthermore, he describes leaving behind only the veil of his nerves and the fibers of his body. These two words, veils and fibers, are reminiscent of the image of bacterial colonies. Veils are a distinctly bacterial shape that occur when bacterial colonies congregate and adhere to the earth and soil. Septimus describes only the fibers of his body being left. This image appears earlier in the novel as well, when Septimus describes the millions of fibers of his own body, and it is this fibrous description reminiscent of bacterial colonies. The image of the body as a fibrous and veiled system spread like a veil upon a rock is the image of a bacterial colony. Septimus not only is broken down by bacteria, but becomes bacterial himself. He is a host to the very bacteria which will outlast his own body. In this way, Septimus acts as a filter passer, another word they used at that time for bacteria, who exists at the intersection of bacteria and human bodies. As Alka describes, influenza functions as something that connects rather than simply infects. In the same way, bacteria are not only transferred between bodies, but also connect the body to a wider life force. Figure 1, the one you're seeing on the PowerPoint right now, embodies Septimus' descriptions of his body's veils and fibers. These drawings of influenza are web-like and fibrous. They contain interconnected bodies spreading over a flat surface like a network. It is an image that also would have been potentially familiar to Woolf, as the shape of bacterium was often discussed in the Times. One article describes how the influenza bacillus was found in various positions, singly, in chains, and in strings. It's kind of fibrous images. This image is also veil-like. It is a solid, flat shape, yet it also has the many small holes and permeable characteristics of a veil. When Septimus describes the veil of nerves and fibers of his body, what he conjures is the image of himself as a bacterial grouping. Bacteria, also called in 20th century language filter passers, embody the kind of porosity Septimus describes. Like a bacterial colony, Septimus lies flat on the back of the world in the soil. Septimus furthermore imagines becoming part of the earth. Red flowers grew through his flesh, their stiff leaves rustled by his head. The image of a body becoming part of the earth is made possible through bacteria. While previous scholars interpret this passage in terms of its connection to war, it can also be read through the spectral presence of influenza. By examining this process of decomposition, the bacteria of the novel make themselves flesh. We can also find bacterial presence through images of swamps. Previous scholarship has examined representations of swamps as another metaphor for war. They've been read as emblematic of a kind of no man's land. However, swamps are also a bacterial space. They are emblematic of the larger bacterial presence in the novel because of their close association with decomposition and extinction made prescient by the death influenza it caused. This is visible when Woolf describes the female singer in the park as singing from a mere hole in the earth, muddy too, matted with root fibers and tangled grasses, still the old bubbling, burbling song. The word choices conjure a swamp-like and grave-like hole bubbling up from the depths of the earth where bacteria abound and eat into the body. Later, Woolf describes this burbling song as soaking through the knotted roots of infinite ages, and skeletons and treasure streamed away in rivulets over the pavements, fertilizing, leaving a damp stain. The use of fertilizing and skeletons suggests the decompositional forces of swamps as a kind of graveyard. The swamp breaks down and absorbs the body. Bacteria act as a damp stain in the textual environment and are acutely visible through the effects they produce on the body. Woolf's representation of decay throughout the novel makes visible the wide network of bacteria. Furthermore, images of decay in connection to deep time gesture towards a bacteria-dominated post-anthropocentric world, a possibility which might not have seemed so far-fetched given the millions of deaths attributed to bacteria during the pandemic. Paul Sangamore describes this as proximate deep time, or Woolf's dealing with prehistoric and pre-modern human communities, the flora and megafauna which they shared the world, and the material traces left by all those in the present. Woolf describes a London eaten through by prokaryotes. All those hurrying along the pavement this Wednesday morning are but bones with a few wedding rings mixed up in their dust and the gold stoppings of innumerable decayed teeth. The bodies Woolf describes are ones eaten through by the non-human. All that is left of humanity by bacteria are its inorganic parts, wedding rings, and gold stoppings. The narrator describes how when all boundaries are lost, the country reverts to its ancient shape as the Romans saw it, and how the hills had no names and rivers would they knew not where. This world reverted to its ancient shape is one where bacteria and microbes rule. The ancient shape is one post-human as well as pre-human. The seeing is both prehistoric as well as futuristic, and the pre- and post-anthropocentric gaze gestures toward the resilience of bacterial life under extreme conditions. These images of bacteria through deep time show how the vast forces of the non-human world flow over and erase all the intricate structures of human community. Bacterial decay results in a post- and pre-anthropocentric society, which suggests the possibility of a bacterial force outlasting host bodies. Bacterial bodies also emerge in the text metaphorically. So this is where I move into a decentered body part. Philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that 20th century life made us relearn how to feel our body. A zoonarratology of illness likewise requires us to relearn how to feel our body in light of the realization of our enmeshment in microbic forces. Bacteria challenges the way we think of the boundaries of the self, since a bacterial body is a self composed of many selves. A bacterial colony is one unit composed of many smaller units of prokaryotes, yet these organisms are also part of a single colony. Bacterial existence is a diffuse dynamic presence that echoes Deleuzian philosophies of network subjectivity. Like a bacterial colony, the decentered self does not have firm boundaries between itself and others, but instead, like bacteria, has porous, membranous interactions with the world and others. Representations of the decentered self act as a kind of bacterial body in the text, a self that, like a bacterial colony, consists of many individual particles operating as a collective unit and vice versa. These metaphorical representations of bacterial existence in connection to Clarissa demonstrate a diffuse, decentralized presence that contains shifting boundaries with others. Clarissa's transcendental theory represents the bacterial way of being. When Clarissa describes her transcendental theory, she describes herself as a decentered and diffuse self. Here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other, she being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling all to bits and pieces as it was, part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist, but it spread ever so far, her life herself. This image of bodies living in each other is the human praxis of the individual bacterial bodies operating within a collective colony. There is no solid individual subject, rather subjectivity is formed through many others. Clarissa is not just one body, but one containing other people, even ones who she has never met. Furthermore, Clarissa's body is not a strictly human one. It is intimately connected to trees at home and the house there. The collective body Clarissa describes is human and non-human. Furthermore, the body Clarissa describes is not rooted in one place or time. She describes the past house at Burton as well as the future, people she has never met. Her body is decentralized and composed of a multiplicity of individual identities functioning within and alongside her own, spreading throughout miles of distance and exponentially multiplying in growth. It spread ever so far, her life herself. Likewise, bacterial colonies capture the idea of the individual operating through a collective body, of a larger body composed of many smaller bodies or cells. Clarissa's transcendental theory focuses especially on the invisible aspects of the body, and in doing so underscores the bacterial nature of the transcendental body. The body Clarissa represents is one which has both visible and invisible parts, and it is the invisible aspect of identity which echoes earlier imagery of microscopic bacteria. Peter describes her theory as the unseen part of us, which spreads wide. The unseen might survive, be recovered, somehow attached to this person or that, or even haunting certain places after death, perhaps. The description of the body Peter describes here is a networked body which attaches to this person or that. This is a body which spreads wide, web-like, like a bacterial colony, and spreads between people. Clarissa's description of how the unseen might survive and even haunt certain places after death is reminiscing of earlier images of decay and the lingering parts of the body broken down by bacteria. Clarissa's description of this body and the construction of subjectivity is one which shares many elements of a bacterial way of being. The human body to Clarissa is one which is embedded in the environment and exists as a network. Identity, therefore, is relational, decentered, and extends beyond the human body itself. This kind of bacterial self is also evident at Clarissa's party. Clarissa describes a network of visiting and the infinite numbers of dull people conglomerating around her. The image of infinite numbers of people conglomerating around Clarissa points to an image of a bacterial colony of individuals blending into a collective body. Clarissa's role as hostess of a party further solidifies the way she adopts a bacterial existence herself, spreading between people, containing many others within her larger body. This is particularly evident in the moment when Clarissa learns of Septimus's death. She is told he died, but never how. However, through their joint subjectivity, she is able to experience her body as well as his. Furthermore, in the last scene of the novel, Clarissa observes an elderly woman closing the blinds. It was fascinating to watch her moving about, that old lady, crossing the room, coming to the window. Scholars have read the representation of the old woman as a future older Clarissa. Clarissa is at once at her party and across the street as a much older version of herself. In the same way bacteria span long distances in time, Clarissa likewise is not restricted to one time or place. She is transtemporal and transspatial. Her identity is not solely her own, but also one of multiples. As Alex Wordling notes, she is an intersubjective character. This intersubjectivity represents a bacterial self, a self which has no core, but which is composed of many smaller pieces spread out over time and space. Likewise, Clarissa's body is one which extends through a network and contains many cells contained in Peter, in the trees at home, and in people she has never met. Her body contains all bodies. Similarly, a bacterial colony is paradoxically a single body in millions of bodies. Reading the pandemic through non-human bodies underscores how illness is itself a living being. In exploring the way illness is transmitted through bacteria, illness ceases to be a passive static force, but is rather the result of intelligent matter responding to environmental circumstances. Illness has never been only about the human body, but about the non-human in close contact with the human. Recent scientific studies point to the ability of bacteria to manipulate human emotions for their needs, to control hunger cravings, emotions, and even physical actions in a way that suggests the intimate symbiotic relationship between human and bacteria, human and microbe. We are our bacteria. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks so much, Caylee, and to all of our panelists today. Fascinating, wonderful work. I wonder if folks would like to take just a couple of minutes to take a breath and gather our thoughts, and then we can come back together for some conversation. All right, let's take a couple of minutes. If folks are ready to head back for some conversation, we can start that up momentarily. All right. So who would like to start us off with a question or comment? Rachel?
Hello. Sorry, it's been so long since I've done this. Have I done everything right?
Yes, you're good.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. That was just such a fantastic panel, really rich and so much to think about. And all three papers in different ways got me thinking about Lady Bruton and where she might fit. I'd really love to hear everyone's thoughts on that. Because I guess we've got her as kind of a hostess who excludes rather than, I guess we get the sense with Clarissa that she includes everyone is coming to her party. Is she maybe a hostess who provides a kind of respite for those caregivers, for the male caregivers, I should say. And then I can't quite remember it, but I'm trying to think of that image after the lunch with Richard and Hugh. With, is it a fibre? Is it a thread or something that connects them and then breaks? So
Spider's web. Yeah, spider's web.
Lady Bruton, that's the main thing. Thank you so much.
Go right ahead, Ananya.
So it's not really a question, but I was just observing how the three papers kind of connected with one another. For example, especially Caylee's paper, which towards the end, it spoke about how Clarissa is acting as a host to the microbes. And I spoke on hospitality. So in hospitality, we considered the guest and the host, and there's a threshold which kinds of provides the hospitality. So I was wondering in this case, if the skin can act as the threshold, which kind of connects the host, which is Clarissa, and how she's kind of surrounded by so many people, and also her recollections of the past, the idea of the long distance recollections, which are almost microbe-like. So I think that was fascinating, and I would like to connect the idea of hospitality with that sometime. And also Emile and Elie's paper, which spoke on caregiving, I think more from a sociological point of view. So I think I have a question in general, since this is the time, and more so because of the pandemic, that we all have been suffering from mental illness on and off, and the suicide cases are almost always everywhere around. So as students of literature and philosophy and sociology, what should be our kind of ethics in regard to this? Because when we talk about caregiving, we kind of think about maybe empathy and emotionally listening to someone and lending a helping hand. But is that enough? I mean, we are kind of in a theoretical structure here, but to think it in more practical terms, where do we stand? So I think I would leave that for a kind of round table to everyone who's here. Yeah.
I'll answer Rachel's question first about Lady Bruton. I love that image that you reminded me of the web breaking, right? Like the spider's web. Yeah, there's a lot of different types of webs in Mrs. Dalloway. Something interesting, and what initially got me started is like fungus, and bacteria. When they're in the ground, they look like a web. And then I also think just this idea of those connecting things being made by non-humans, I found really interesting, like that being the metaphor, instead of it being, like a string. I think sometimes it's just, I'm trying to remember, but like mostly it's like the spider's web. Yeah, Lady Bruton's a really interesting figure. I haven't thought about her too much in terms of the microbes, but I think she would be a really interesting character to incorporate in, especially after hearing also about, let's see, like when she doesn't include Clarissa at her party, like what might that suggest about keeping certain microbe networks separated, because I remember in Outca's book at the end, like one of my favorite parts when she's looking at Mrs. Dalloway is how she talks about how Sally and another woman at the party are connected because both of their sons, got, was it measles or smallpox, something like that at school together. So they were connected through illness. So it'd be kind of interesting to think about that. And then for Ananya's question, I think, yes, when you were reading your paper about hospitality and you were talking about how hospitality is an incorporation of the other into the self. And I love this idea that you brought up with like the skin being this kind of contact point, because I think hospitality, like when you truly welcome someone into your home, like you touch them and you greet them or like shake their hand or hug them, and that's really what makes it home, especially that feminine aspect that you brought up. So I think that's a really cool way to look at it. It was just brilliant. I was also thinking for Elie and Emile's paper for caregiving, it's interesting because caregiving makes illness a shared experience, because you have the person who's ill and then you have the person taking care of them. And I feel like even like for anyone who has experienced caregiving, it does feel like you take on that illness like yourself, like it has its own physical effects. So in that way, illness becomes a shared experience as well. So I thought that was a really interesting connection between our papers.
Great. Did anyone want to respond? Or I know Mary Claire had her hand up.
I just want to add something that just came to me now that we're discussing this, the metaphor of the skin, the microbes. You know, our skin has a lot of microbes, like that's part of our skin microbiome. Some of it is actually beneficial for us. The only time becomes an issue is when your uppermost skin layer becomes degraded, and then you will start to have your infections as a result of this skin degradation. So just to keep linking our papers together, when it comes to the caregiver, if we look at the caregiver as the host, and then you look at everything else, all the burden that's coming onto that caregiver, the minute the caregiver starts to suffer, start to get sick themselves, start to feel like they cannot handle the strain anymore, the weaknesses started, the cracks, if you will, start to show, and that's when also the caregiver becomes ill. And so now you have to take care of the caregiver as well as taking care of the person that they're taking care of. And this is something that in public health, this is always an important area of intervention, especially with people with chronic illnesses, and following up with the caregivers, because that's very important. For Lady Bruton, I think Elie might have better answer than this, but I think we do look at her in our analysis to assess her perception of Richard. We use her as our lens to look at how she's judging the relationship, the role of Richard as a caregiver. But maybe Elie, you can shed more light on that regard.
Yes, I would like to add to what Emile was saying, that yes, although we do not focus on Lady Bruton as a character on herself and as a hostess herself, like Emile said, we saw how Richard and how Hugh were described from the perspective of that lunch that they attended, and even the helper actually who works at Lady Bruton's house, she gave us a certain perspective of Hugh. And we used this perspective in our paper to show that Hugh seems like a person who's well off. He's attending lunches. He only cares about his chicken. That's literally what she says. So it's not. He looks like someone who's not actually worried about his wife, like Septimus. Like in the case of Razzia. So this is if we want to talk about Lady Bruton. And I would like to add, because when we spoke about, actually when Caylee and Ananya spoke about the web. Part of my thesis, since I'm working on heterotopias in Mrs. Dalloway, I was interested in that in the first place because Woolf describes the novel before she actually started writing it as an interconnected web of characters. So I think this also can feed into the imagery of webs that is used, because the author herself used this description before even writing the novel.
Mary Claire, did you want to go ahead and then we can hear from Jane?
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. 3 brilliant papers. You were all centering on this idea of being ill and being in contact, or indeed hosting viruses, hosting other people, as being a positive experience and a good thing. We're all interconnected. And I totally agree, but of course, having been through over 2 years of the pandemic, it feels more like an antagonism. And I was wondering, I was thinking about our relationship to virus and bacteria, this dialogue that humans have with the microbial world as being one more of actually developing resistances to continual mutations. And I would just wonder what your thoughts are, this idea of, I mean, the end goal of an infection is to become resistant. And then it's like the virus responds and develops a new strain, and you got to become resistant again. This idea of resistance seems opposing to ideas of like hospitality, intersubjectivity. And I'm just wondering, what are all of your thoughts about resistance, even like maybe narrative is resistance, or these characters showing some kind of resistance?
Can I say? Yeah. So that's a very interesting question, because indeed we have been talking only about the positives, but pandemic has taken a toll on us. So I think I would like to talk about it from the viewpoint of Derrida, who divides hospitality into 2 types, one conditional and the other is unconditional. So he says that conditional one is something where you are kind of setting certain rules and regulations, laws and rights. And when the foreigner comes to your door, you flurry them with questions like, what is your name? What is your language? Where are you coming from? But unconditional hospitality, according to him, is something where you do not ask anything. It's almost like a surprise visit from a person where you have nothing to do and you just have to let them be. So I think I look at this pandemic as a kind of unconditional hospitality where you are actually not prepared to have this kind of infection, although you know that you might have, but unless you're having a test or you're kind of going to the doctors, you don't know if you're infected or if you're likely to infect others. So I was trying to look at it in that sense. But the problem of unconditional hospitality, as Derrida says, is that it will always lead to some kind of violence. It always carries the threat of violence, because if you are being that good to your guests that you allow them to enter without asking any question, put them under no rules and regulations, no surveillance, then probably it will kind of turn the guest-host dynamic after a point, and the guest becomes the host and the host becomes the guest. So in the context of the microbial infection, I was wondering if that can be also seen as a kind of threat or a kind of violence that the guest is bringing to our body. Although I'm not sure if I would call this unconditional, because this is more like something that we wouldn't want to have. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, I love this question because I feel like during the pandemic, this is what made me think about it. I was like, oh my God, I feel like the germs are everywhere. Like I feel them. And I was like, oh, I wonder if they felt that during the pandemic then. I think it depends, when I was writing this paper, I was trying to think like, okay, if I were bacteria, and so for bacteria, it's like, how do I survive to these environments that are trying to change against me? In terms of the hostility, I think we can look at it as hostile. I also think from like the microbiological perspective, when there's a virus, not necessarily bacteria, because we know flu is a virus now, we incorporate DNA from the virus into our own DNA. So the resistance is really the virus encountering like itself almost. So it becomes like a kind of incorporation, and then the virus is like, okay, now I have to change again. So it is kind of still like a meeting of the bodies, although certainly unpleasant. I don't enjoy being sick at all. But I think it depends on, if we see ourselves as part of the environment and as part of a network. It's not us versus them. It's just us realizing that we've already been within this. And suddenly when we're sick, we're like, oh yeah, we are within this larger network. And really, even though it may seem to hurt us, it's good for the bacteria. Like they get to live, like the virus gets to survive. So, it's positive in that way for those microbial forces. So I think when we don't see the human necessarily as like the end all be all to be protected, it doesn't end up being so much as an us versus them, but it's kind of hard to think that way in reality, right? Because like, I don't like echo, all of those things, but it was a great question, really interesting. Thank you.
Jane, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for such fascinating papers. I thought this is such a rich discussion and such a rich set of papers. I just wanted to discuss really the second paper. It was so interesting to bring Lucrezia and Richard and Hugh into comparison. I've not really seen a comparison across them as carers. And I just wanted to sort of explore a little bit further what difference it makes about the nature of illness of the partner, because Septimus, clearly has a very severe psychotic illness, and whether there's a sense that Lucrezia is kind of caught up as well in the stigma attached to that, and that's what's kind of isolating her. And something that also connects everything here is that, of course, Clarissa had influenza. And as a result of that, she's got a heart condition, which is why she has to rest. So whether that kind of affects her role and Richard's role as her carer. And then thirdly, with Evelyn, I know you mentioned on the slide it was a mental illness, and possibly there is a sort of some sort of depression or something, but it doesn't seem to be quite severe, does it? Because there seems to be this bit about, well, Evelyn's always going into nursing homes and so on. And there's also a hint that it's probably something gynecological, because when Clarissa meets Hugh, and I got the book out just to double check I remember this correctly, Hugh sort of says, intimating by a kind of pout or swell of his well-covered, manly, extremely handsome, perfectly upholstered body, he was almost too well dressed always, but presumably had to be with his little job at the court, that his wife had some internal ailment, nothing serious, which as an old friend, Clarissa Dalloway would quite understand without requiring him to specify. So it seems that kind of long-winded way that he's not talking about it, and whether that also affects his role as a carer, that he's kind of distancing himself from an illness that he probably finds rather embarrassing and just want to talk about, and quite happy that his wife is perhaps secluded and suffering this by herself. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I just wondered if you had any other thoughts about the difference between those three, and perhaps if anybody wanted to add anything about influenza as Clarissa's, the thing that's brought on Clarissa's illness.
Thank you so much for your question. I think that obviously I agree with you, and I think that the scope of our paper, or when you actually started to write our paper, we were very interested in the severity of the ailment of each of the patients or each of the care recipients. Obviously, Septimus is or has the most severe case, and this is definitely reflected on Lucrezia. Now, obviously, the severity of the ailment plays a very important role, but I think the major thing, or the main thing that we wanted to focus on in our paper, is that it's all a combination of things. Like, yes, the severity of the ailment of Septimus definitely plays an important role, but had Lucrezia, for example, had or received more social support, then maybe this wouldn't have been the outcome. Had Lucrezia been of a better socioeconomic status, then maybe she could have afforded the rest houses that the doctors were recommending. Maybe she could have, I don't know, if she had her family around her, then all of this wouldn't have happened. So when it comes to Clarissa and Evelyn, based on what we see in the novel, then definitely it's all about how active the character can be. The issue with Septimus and Lucrezia is that there's a sort of, like you said, stigma, because he is a man who was in the army, and now he's acting like someone who's completely deprived of his masculinity. When he's usually traveling or wandering around the park, lots of people are calling them queer. They don't understand what this couple is going through, whereas Richard and Hugh, whenever they're wandering around the streets of London, they are welcome. They visit shops. Everyone respects them. So the social environment, I believe, plays the most important part in this case, because had Lucrezia received the support of her social environment, then she wouldn't have faced all of these issues on her own. Definitely the severity of the ailment plays an important part, but it's not the only part that causes her to have such a bad, if you want, experience with caregiving.
We have a question waiting in the chat from Anne. She asks, is there a scope in Mrs. Dalloway to conceptualize care as a gift rather than loss? A turn to meeting that part of the self that is selfish or altruistic?
Okay, so if we're talking about care, I think that this question is targeted to our paper, at least I'm assuming. I think that this is a very good comment, especially since we actually hint at it at the end. We say that, yes, obviously Septimus loses his life to suicide. However, the recipient of that gift of him actually deciding to die to suicide is his wife. So yes, caregiving, the experience that Rexia had with caregiving is definitely not an easy one. But Wolf decides to reward her, maybe to reward her for all of these efforts that she puts in the caregiving process by gifting her the final act of the novel and by freeing her of her caregiver burden. Because if you think about it, yes, Richard and you do not have the same, do not face the same intensity when it comes to caregiving, but they still have to care for their wives. Lucrezia, by the end of the novel, does not have that responsibility anymore. So yes, maybe caregiving in that case can be seen as a gift because she's finally free.
Thank you. I know, Tanya, you had your hand up as well.
Sure. I just had a comment going back to the idea of resistance against microbes. And I was thinking about how in Mrs. Dalloway, there's this constant tension between the connected nature of people. And I'm thinking about the pattern behind the cotton wool as another iteration of the veil versus the solitary self. And I'm thinking about Peter Walsh's Solitary Traveler. And I'm wondering if we could look at resistance as part of like the feeling of being solitary and resisting connection with others, or not quite being able to see it because of that veil-like nature.
I can jump in. I have some unfiltered thoughts. Yeah, I think that's super interesting because Peter is that kind of solitary figure, and certainly looking at it from, you know, like the bacterial perspective, he is like, you know, resistance to being part of, you know, that wider life force. Then like when I think of Clarissa's transcendental theory, you know, it just kind of encompasses, you know, even people who choose not to be part of it. But I agree that yeah, there is something with like choosing to not recognize like embeddedness in the ecosystem. Like when I looked at it in through my paper, and there is that kind of solitude that results. I'm trying to think of what else too, because Peter, like even when he comes to visit Clarissa, you know, he sits across from her, and you know, there's no close contact. And when I first started that scene, just after being through COVID, and you know, I'm like thinking like social distancing, you know, like not coming too close. So I think in that way, you know, the possibility of spreading bacteria can, you know, create this resistance, can create this barrier to connection. It's definitely something to think about. Thank you. I'm gonna keep processing. My brain doesn't fully turn on until like 10:30. So
Ananya, did you want to build on that?
Yeah, I was actually referring to the question asked by Anne. Just wanted to add that in Three Guineas, if I'm not mistaken, I think Woolf subtly drops a hint about caregiving as a kind of, not really a gift, I would say, but like as a kind of escape for the women, because during those days, women had no access to the outside world. And the only time they could probably step outside were when the soldiers came wounded and they had to just go and nurse them, which is also probably the reason why they were supporting war. I think Woolf discusses this under the reasons why even women tend to support war. And one of that was this. So, but yeah, I wouldn't say that was a kind of a gift for them, but it was more of an agency at that point of time where they could care for someone, and that would give them some time to stay out of their domestic chores and that sort of thing. Yeah, so I think that's my thought.
There's another comment in the chat. I think Woolf is being sarcastic about caring for others as a woman. And on being ill, she does not approve the idea that women should be necessarily caring and impose sympathy. If we see her family, Woolf's mother was a nurse, and she herself was once a caretaker of her sister and brother when they came down with tuberculosis and influenza. Ritzia in Mrs. Dalloway is also a woman taking care of her mentally damaged husband. So I think Woolf does not approve forced altruism and sympathy on women. If anyone wants to follow up on that comment in the minute that we have left.
Yeah, I just want to say briefly, I think that this is a good comment because it touches on several questions we had before. For our paper, maybe we cannot talk about, you know, resistance in the same sense of microbial resistance, but we can talk about adapting and becoming resilient when you are put under so much pressure and expectations. And it doesn't seem that Woolf is interested in taking Ritzia down that road. The answer is not to make her so strong that she's able to handle and withhold all this pressure that is thrust upon her that other people don't have to deal with. The idea is that she is giving her that release, because like Elie mentions towards the end of the presentation, when we talk about sympathy, it's exactly what is being discussed in the chat right now. it's not about feeling bad for her and wanting to sympathize with her and just wanting to support her. Maybe the answer is just to give her a better life. And we see that also reflected maybe in some of Wolf's decisions towards the end of hers. This feeling of patient guilt is something that is also part of the equation that should be taken into account. Maybe the patient doesn't want the caregiver to be altruistic to that extreme level. Maybe this is why when we see Septimus looking at the missing ring, he feels relief because his relationship is falling apart. So it's not just about the caregiver wanting to be released, it's also about the care recipient wanting to be absolved from the guilt of having to change the life of another person. So to us, this is how the novel can be read. This is how we believe to read it. And I think on a personal note, looking at a lot of the women in our lives that had to sacrifice a lot to be caregivers, especially through wars, especially through crises. Sometimes you wish it's not just about how much keep asking women to make sacrifices, rather, but just making their lives better. So this is the take-home message for us personally.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presenters. This was an excellent panel, and this is a great conversation, wonderful questions. So thanks to everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at the Wolf Conference. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Of course.